You are listening to In Pursuit of Development with Dan Banik.
Climate change is often discussed as a future risk, something we model, project, and plan for. But for millions of people, especially in fragile and conflict-affected settings, climate disruption is already a lived reality. It shapes how food is grown, how water is accessed, how livelihoods survive or fail, and how communities cope under pressure. What the research increasingly shows is that climate change rarely operates in isolation. It interacts with poverty, inequality, insecurity, and weak governance, often intensifying existing vulnerabilities. Rather than acting as a single cause of violence, climate change functions more accurately as a risk multiplier. It amplifies stresses that are already present and, in some contexts, pushes societies closer to instability or conflict. Now, these dynamics are rarely straightforward. Seemingly limited environmental shocks can set off wider chains of consequences across social systems, producing effects far beyond the original event. For example, a drought is not just a drought. It can undermine livelihoods, drive displacement, strain institutions, and deepen grievance. A drought can heighten the risk of violence, and sometimes it can also reshape political order. In other cases, similar pressures can generate cooperation, adaptation, and even new forms of governance. But global priorities are currently being reshuffled, further complicating this picture. Across much of the world, especially in Europe, defense spending has surged, driven by geopolitical tensions and a growing sense of insecurity. While military budgets have expanded rapidly, development aid and climate finance continue to face mounting pressure. As one of my more recent guests on the show, Nilima Gulrajani, has argued in a recent op-ed, this growing emphasis on military expenditure has not made the world more secure. Instead, it risks crowding out the very investments in health, energy, education, and climate resilience that underpin long-term stability. This trade-off matters because most security risks today, such as climate change, pandemics, food shocks, and cyber threats, are not primarily territorial. They are transboundary and systemic. However, our financing frameworks still privilege a narrow and militarized understanding of security, one that can weaken resilience, distort priorities, and leave societies more exposed, not less. Nowhere is this more visible than in the world's poorest countries. Least developed countries receive less than 1/5 of global climate finance, and the institutions actually responsible for implementing climate-resilient programs often see only a fraction of that. Communities facing floods, land degradation, and livelihood loss are moving ahead with reforestation, irrigation, and flood protection. They are doing so not because funding is abundant, but because necessity leaves no alternative. These are not abstract policy debates. They go to the heart of how we define security, whose security counts, and whether climate action is treated as a cost or as an investment in stability and peace. So in today's episode, we explore the intersection of climate, development, and security. We focus on pathways, context, and political choices. When climate stress deepens fragility, when it fuels conflict, and when, under the right conditions, it can actually become an entry point for cooperation and peacebuilding. My guest is Florian Krampe, Director of Studies for Peace and Development at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI. Florian's work sits at the intersection of research and policy, examining how climate change reshapes security risks, how institutions respond to overlapping crises, and where opportunities exist for environmental cooperation and peacebuilding, even in deeply divided contexts. I hope you enjoy the conversation. I'm Dan Banik, and you are listening to In Pursuit of Development. Florian, good to see you. Welcome to the show.
Yes, thanks for having me.
There has been growing interest among scholars in trying to see or trying to identify, nuance the picture of how climate change is potentially or is posing to be a huge problem for development. You could talk about weather patterns, natural disasters, crop failures. We're really worried about food production, the population increasing. So there are potentially huge problems. Give us a little sense of how the literature is, according to you, in terms of climate being this huge challenge in the development landscape before we talk about the security landscape. Is there anything that we are missing out on? Is there anything that we need to highlight even more going forward in terms of the adverse effects of climate change on, say, development?
Yeah, no, thank you for having me, and thank you for that question. I think that is a really important point, and to start on the development side, I mean, for me, there's no question that climate change is a major factor that is undermining the development pretty much everywhere. For us in Scandinavia, as well as in South Asia, in Africa, and the Middle East. And I think in that sense, it's a really important factor. A large part of that is really the impact that climate change has on livelihood, and we'll come back to that when we talk about the security dimension. But it's this fundamental factor which has a quite direct impact on people's lives, on people's vulnerability. And you see that in a lot of the cases. If you look at fragile conflict-affected states, it's 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% of the population that is employed in the agriculture sector, one sector that is really directly impacted by the weather phenomena and dynamics that are playing out as part of larger climate change. In regard to where we need to put a heightened attention, I think that is maybe more a reflection on the current state where we are in the world. Specifically with regard to development, we see a shrinking of investment into development. Overall, overseas development assistance is shrinking in multiple governments. And that's going to be a tremendous factor and impact on people. We already see that today, that pretty much fragile and conflict-affected states barely get any climate finance, if any.
Yeah, so, I've been having lots of conversations this season with people regarding this concerning development that aid is shrinking, and the typical areas where many of the Western donors were focusing on, there's less money, whether it is health, whether it is climate, etc. But there's also this other dimension, which I'd like to discuss with you, because you mentioned Scandinavia. You're currently in Sweden, I'm in Norway. In our parts of the world, I would say there's been much more interest on the climate aspect. And there's this fear, this danger I've seen in recent years, Florian, where there's been more of an emphasis on climate investment funds and climate smart agriculture, climate proofing everything. And the danger is that, typical sort of development, a main focus on, say, poverty reduction, that a lot of these countries that you and I are interested in, that focus is reduced because in our parts of the world, we are obsessed with climate. And when I speak to policymakers in other parts of the world, especially in the global south, they say, it's not like we are not interested in climate change. It's just that you guys are not giving us enough money for pure development stuff. Any thoughts you have on that?
I think that is an important realization, because it's not, we tend to silo everything. And if you look at the financial flows, it's a climate adaptation project. You can't spend that money on development. But let's be honest, you know that yourself from your work, like, how is a project that is a climate adaptation project in Somalia, how can that not be a development project?
Yeah.
It is by design. If you're making an irrigation channel climate resilient, that's going to have a development impact. And we see that in other cases. I saw that in Nepal, where the micro hydropower development, that was good. You got electricity. That's a tremendous development impact. But just by building that infrastructure of the water canals, you had so much impact on food security, because just like your irrigation system was better. So we try to divorce those things in politics instead of bringing them together and seeing that they are integrated. And I think the part also missing of that is like, well, it's climate adaptation, it's development, but it's also peace building.
And I agree with you generally, Florian. But my point is that sometimes the projects or the donors tend to formulate these projects as just exclusively combating climate change, maybe emphasizing emission reduction, maybe focusing on sectors that recipient governments are not necessarily prioritizing. So that's where the frustration appears. They say, we want you to focus more on, food production. Yeah, okay, you can always have a climate aspect to it, water, food security, all of these. But if a donor is suggesting a focus on something very targeted at just say pollution control or something like that, or overall emissions, or saying close down your coal-fired power plants, then people are saying, no, we need energy. We really need to reduce, poverty. So that should be our focus. But going back to the first point, Florian, so what we really should be talking about is much more about natural resource governance, about land reforms, maybe, water and ecosystems. All of this is important, not just for development, but as you were saying, also when we think of climate as a source of conflict. But climate is, on the one hand, really bad. I mean, the changing climate is bad for development. But the added aspect here is that it's bad for development also because it is creating conflict within communities. For example, communities that are reliant on the primary sector, agriculture. Not enough water, not enough food production, conflict. So we have to see this hand in hand, right? And I think that is the essence of a lot of your work.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we look at. Like, what is the security implications of climate change? And as you point out, they are translating a lot through that vulnerability. If we look at the research on the topic, we see, I think by now, in my perspective, we have reached a consensus that climate change is increasing the risk of conflict. But it is not the only cause, and context matters. So it's not a given. And that is creating a lot of difficulty, especially for us. I mean, sort of at CIPRI, we work very closely in the political space and with policymakers and giving advice and trying to provide this nuanced understanding to drive implementation based on evidence. And that brings a difficulty. For us as academics, we would be happy to discuss causality forever. If you're a policymaker, you don't have that time. I think that is one of the mistakes we have done in this debate, that we have waited too long for the evidence to really prove that climate change is a cause, instead of understanding this is a risk factor, one of several, and we need to address that. And what we see in our research and the way we use it is that we're looking at pathways and very much not talking about causal mechanisms, but more like seeing the pathway as an avenue, a highway. It's like it goes in one direction, but how fast and on which lane you're going, that's different. That depends.
Yeah, so and there's a lot of talk about the double burden. So if you have a society where there's violence, conflict, and facing the brunt of a changing climate, then that society, and particularly if it is a low-income country, that society is at higher risk of various types of problems, development, security, etc.
Yeah, that's what we typically take as the least common denominator. If we can agree on one thing, it is that those countries that are impacted by climate change and by conflict are really struggling, because while dealing with climate impacts alone is complicated, dealing with conflict is complicated. Now we put both together, and both are interacting and compounding each other and having these dynamics. It's making it worse. It's making it really complicated and demanding that we need to acknowledge that both are there. So the peacekeeping side, for instance, wouldn't have the privilege of saying, no, we do peacekeeping and we focus on that aspect. We don't do development, or we don't do climate change. Now, the reality is, if you look at a case like South Sudan, the UN mission there, the peacekeeping troops, it's like, well, they have construction equipment, they have excavators, and a large part of what they're doing is, during the flood season, is securing runways, securing roads, and making sure that the humanitarian aid can be delivered. Right? That is a direct response to climate impacts that are manifesting in a case like South Sudan. And we see that in multiple other cases.
I was just suddenly thinking about Afghanistan, and around like a decade ago when I was at Stanford, I had an office neighbor, the former US ambassador, who was a general, a 4-star general, the US ambassador to Afghanistan. And we were talking about the role of the military. And he was saying that the military, this is Carl Eichenberry, by the way, and he was saying that the role of military in Afghanistan, the US military, actually had also a development impact because they were keeping the peace. They were providing security, but as you said, they have the excavators, they were building roads, they were connecting villages. And so there's a different way of looking at, even the role of the military. But if you were to think about certain countries, Florian, that come to your mind, where you see that conflict and a changing climate exacerbating the problem, what would those be? I'm thinking of Afghanistan, there may be lots in the Sahel region of the African continent. I mean, South Sudan, you mentioned. What are the other areas, hotspots, where you see that combination to be a deadly combination?
I think, you mentioned several of those already. There's Iraq, there's Somalia, the Horn of Africa as such, really, really important. But also in Latin America, where things are playing out differently. In Southeast Asia, again, things are playing out differently. And I think that is a fascinating thing from a research perspective, actually around this agenda, and maybe the difficulty and the complexity that is hard to grasp. It's different where you look. And while in Somalia, climate change impacts and through flooding or droughts might be driving community-based violence, we see in other parts, also in Somalia, but especially then in parts of the Sahel, we see farmer-herder conflict playing out, and that dynamic. Whereas in South Asia, we're going to see mass riots and more popular uprising, and we don't see the same dynamics, right? And in Southeast Asia, again, there's some studies that suggest actually because of the impact on livelihoods, and especially on fishers, warming waters, the fish are going to deeper waters, and that means further away, that piracy is increasing, right? Not to simplify the links, but just to show the complexity. And then if you look at Latin America, you see that a whole different set of issues comes up, including really important the work around environmental defenders, sort of environmental crime and those dynamics playing out. So it is making things really complicated because you would see that same climate impact is having various different security implications. And that makes it hard, right? It's not like 25 battle-related deaths. It's more complex.
But talking about security and coming closer to home, it's not just a challenge in these areas that we're talking about in terms of fragile and conflict-afflicted states that are facing the brunt of climate change. You've argued, I read a piece where you've argued that our obsession with defense spending, and by the way, in Europe, we've really increased defense spending with a bit of a nudge or a force from the US president, that, we all should be providing more money for defense, and we have wars in our region. Ukraine has led to this mass increase, an uptick on defense spending. You've argued that we've actually, in that process, ignored climate change. Help us understand that argument, that maybe NATO has somehow, or the European leaders are not paying enough attention to climate while they are actually paying a lot of attention to security. And this could be a security threat in the future.
Not in the future. It is today.
It's today.
Yeah. So in 24, we spent 2.7 trillion US dollars on defense, on military expenditure, according to CPRI data. 2.7 trillion. I don't know how many zeros that is, but it's quite a lot. I'm not even want to contrast that with what we would need to solve climate change, but pretty much we got that covered. But I think what I find fascinating at the moment is there's, without doubt, there's a changed security landscape in Europe. And we have to be real and we have to acknowledge that. And defense spending is not going to go down in the very near future. It's likely to go up and stay at a certain level. But what really confuses me is that the European Union, NATO, and all these organizations have identified in the previous years that climate change is a fundamental security issue for them. And all of a sudden, it's gone. Climate change is not talked about anymore, right? And it was a key factor that was talked about in the defense space just 2 years ago. So what happened? Climate change didn't go away. So the discourse changed. The focus changed. Like Trump is pushing the expenditure. My argument is that we have to recognize two things. One is that climate change is not it is a security issue in low-income countries, in fragile and conflict-affected states? Absolutely. But we're ignoring that climate change is already today undermining our security also in Europe.
Help us understand how so, Florian, because we are focused on hard security all the time, right?
Yeah.
But when you have overflowing rivers, when we have natural disasters, when we have the collapse of the electricity grid, as you know, what happened in Spain a few months ago, are those the kind of things you're thinking of?
Yes and no. I think we need to go a step further, and that is why it's so important and so surprising, because we see that melting ice in the Arctic is impacting the infrastructure of military runways. It's impacting the foundations of early warning radar stations, core defense infrastructure, ports, sea level rise impacting ports. I think that is a factor we are underestimating. We're ignoring that is climate change is today directly impacting our defense posture while we are trying to build up our defense posture. And that I find ironic because that is very short-sighted and is driving investments and it's driving a way of defense spending that is essentially building security for a time that is not the time.
I find it puzzling that we are increasing our defense spending.
Hmm.
Why can't we say that we are earmarking some of that increase to climate proof these runways or these
Yeah.
infrastructures that the military are going to use? I mean, it makes no sense.
Yeah.
Why do you think there's less talk about climate in this defense spending spree?
I think it's because of the sensitivities around that. It is because of the changing security landscape. Some are very happy that they don't have to deal with climate change anymore. Some are strategically avoiding talking about it. And as we know, politics is sometimes extremely short-sighted, and we are focusing on the narrow picture. Be that what it may. I think the important part here is really that exactly as you say. So NATO decided to spend 5% on defense now. But within that is 1.5% on building resilience building. So there is a space to exactly do the adaptation measures that you mentioned. And the US military has identified that over the last couple of years and has made proper adaptation plans on how to adapt their bases and climate proof things. But the part that I find missing at the moment is the opportunity, because we're using all this money for building defense systems of the past instead of looking at the innovation. So once we figured out synthetic fuels, off-grid battery systems, microgrids, and all these types of things, once we figured that out, and we need them militarily because it's important military logistical considerations. But that is an opportunity to drive this type of investment, which has so many civilian applications. And quite frankly, also, I think in the humanitarian arena, both from the pure operation space that we're operating in, but also just like I think we're missing this dual gain opportunity where this investment will make us safer in a more holistic understanding of security, but it will also supercharge innovation in the renewable energy and climate resilience space for Europe.
My hunch is that it is easier to talk about these issues when a war is happening far away. As soon as it comes closer to home with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we get caught up in a different discourse. And one thing I've noticed, correct me if I'm wrong, Florian, when we think about the destruction of what's happening in Ukraine, the consequences of the war, it is obviously very important and right for the media to highlight the sheer loss of lives and the destruction of infrastructure. But am I right in saying that we haven't really heard the environmental impacts or the negative consequences of war, what it does? And it's not just Ukraine, also Gaza. When you see an area absolutely flattened, apart from people losing their livelihoods, they're losing their lives, there's huge amount of dust, huge destruction of forests, huge destruction of natural resources.
Yeah.
So there is that link, I'm sure, that we should also be highlighting. Or do you think that has been highlighted in Ukraine, Gaza, etc.?
I think it has been highlighted in Ukraine substantially more than in a lot of other conflicts. I'm pretty sure, I mean, I don't know, I haven't heard anything about Sudan,
Mm.
where I'm pretty sure there's going to be substantial environmental impacts of the war playing out, as in all of these other conflicts that we are not looking at. UNEP has done an assessment on Gaza, on the environmental impact of the war there. Of course, it's political. It's difficult, especially for UN bodies. So there's a need for independent research. But I think Ukraine stands out as a really interesting example here, where from the very beginning, Ukraine has started to monitor the environmental impacts of the war and collected that and a lot of external expertise. So, and it has been paid more attention to in various ways. And I think one reflection of that is that a couple of years ago in one of the peace plans by Zelensky, environmental impacts and environmental reconstruction was actually part of the peace plan. And I haven't seen many peace plans where environmental considerations were one of the key points.
Did this get a lot of attention?
No, not to the same degree, but comparatively to other conflicts, it got attention, I would say. I mean, take Chernobyl, take the Krakow Dam, right? Those were events that definitely made it to the news. What I think we're missing, though, is that a lot of those assessments, I mean, and in Ukraine, the UNDP, UNEP, OSCE, all are working in this space and are doing assessments. The challenge is how do we do that in ongoing conflicts? Because, well, we can't go in and take a water sample at the front line. So we need to find a lot of innovation and different ways of monitoring these types of impacts. But I think one part that I think is missing is what is really I mean, so it's great. We have data on, okay, so the pollution and copper density and sort of you get very nitty-gritty in the what factors of the pollution are there. But what is actually the social consequence for people living there? That is a picture I don't have seen a lot of attention to. And I think that is really important because that is going to matter. Those people impacted by the dust of the destruction of bomb blasts and the destroyed concrete. What happens with the increased arsenic density in the soil and etc.? What does that do to people and to livelihoods and everything? So I think that is where really more research and attention needs to pay to.
I did not know that Ukraine, the government there was monitoring this kind of data, which
Yeah.
is really nice. I suppose there, the one question would be coming from opposition sources would be the credibility of the data. You guys are exaggerating or whatever. But let's say there is data, Florian. I would still argue that in a situation such as war and this kind of conflict, environment is going to be the last wagon in politics. It's not at the front line. That's not going to persuade people to agree to a peace plan. I mean, am I being naive here? I mean, can you really use environment and climate as a tool? And so we're getting to the final part of our conversation, because in peace building, I'm sure there are existing lots of models. I have no idea about what these are. You're the expert. I'm sure even before climate appeared on the agenda, there were surely some peace building blocks. But now that we've established that climate can be a huge source of conflict, how can climate change be used as a source of peace? And this whole concept of environmental peace building. So help us understand how that would work.
I think that is a really fascinating part and a really important balancing point for this discussion. Because all I said is true, right? Climate change is, I mean, you have this double vulnerability, fact. And we know climate change is increasing the risk of conflict. But I found that really, there was one sentence that stuck with me from my PhD in Uppsala. Ashok Swain and Peter Wallenstein wrote about environmental cooperation. Paraphrasing, but it's essentially like cooperation is so much more common than conflict. And I think that is a really important thing to remember. And that is especially where in the water sector, a lot of focus has been on, where water wars, the risk is real. And that goes back to the point about let's identify the risk and then have responses to it. The risk is real. We need to identify the risks. But we see that cooperation around water resources, even in highly politically sensitive situations, is happening. And I think that is an important reminder. So out of that discourse comes this understanding like, okay, so environment certainly can be a driver and a factor in conflict, but actually it can be a source of peace. And environmental cooperation in particular can be a factor that provides opportunities to drive that. My critique to that discourse over the years has always been that sometimes one of the strategies is to make it technocratic. And so let's talk about, when we talk about water cooperation, we talk about very technical aspects and try to take the politics out of it. Now, that is good, but I'm a peace and conflict researcher. I'm a political scientist. If you strategically take the politics out of it, that's a political decision. And so we can't escape politics. We need to acknowledge politics and we need to drive that. And I think that's actually where the opportunities lie. Because once we understand these are political issues, how can you, in India, the water sector, the water levels are state security. They're confidential. How can we argue that's not a high political issue, but that's just purely technocratic, right? It doesn't make sense. The same in Ethiopia around the dam building there. It's a high political issue. So we need to acknowledge the politics. And that opens up ways to identify entry points for peace building, I think.
So are we talking about reframing the issue? So most conflicts have some well-known causes, I would imagine. Everybody agrees this is what we're fighting over. Even disagreements in, say, Ethiopia, between Ethiopia and Egypt, on the fact that Ethiopia is building or has already built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD, water sharing, typical sort of disagreements. I'm getting less water, you guys are punishing me. The other party saying, you benefited from this water all these decades, now it's our turn. So you have those rather well established. But in still other situations, based on what you just said, I'm thinking that maybe the political framing of the cause of the conflict isn't as explicitly framed as an environment and a climate problem. So are you saying that in the peace building process, as you were saying, maybe these have to be framed even more actively as a political problem that needs solutions? So connecting the dots more, is that what you're saying?
Not framed, understood.
Mm-hmm.
We have to understand that they are fundamentally political questions, especially in societies that are 80% dependent on the water sector for employment in agriculture. That is really important. If we don't understand the political dimensions, then we can decide if we frame it this way or not.
Yeah, I was using the term framing more as like, let's say I'm a peace negotiator.
Yeah.
I'm bringing two parties to the table and say, look, you guys are actually fighting over the wrong issue. You don't seem to know where the disagreement really is. Look, there's something bigger at work here. If only we refocused, then perhaps there would be a solution. That is what I was thinking.
Yeah, I would contest that one course of conflict we rarely agree on. We did research on Mali and we interviewed a lot of people, and I still don't think I have one answer that is one answer what caused the conflict. So then there's another factor. Do the root causes of war or conflict actually matter for resolution? So it's a bit more complex there. But to your point, I want to bring in the example of Kosovo. Kosovo, we know the Kosovo War. That wasn't about water. But in the post-conflict space, the UN mission is there. We have a divided city in Mitrovica. We have the reservoir for the water supply of the city is on the Serb territory. The water treatment plant is on the Albanian territory. And this water treatment plant supplies water to the Serb part of the city. So you can take that as what it is. And UNMIK in that situation was like, okay, there were tensions around the water supply. The Serbs didn't want to pay for the water supplied by the Albanians, etc. And then the UN paid the bill. And cooperation around water did not happen. Because in my argument, it wasn't recognized as an opportunity for being a bit more forceful on facilitating peace building and cooperation. Because if you look at it, you're like, well, okay, what happens if the Serbs switch off the water? If the Albanians don't get water. But if the Serbs switch off the water and the Albanians don't have water, that treatment plant is not giving you water to the Serb areas. So the Serbs can't switch off the water. Well, the Albanians can't switch the water either, because then the Serbs switch off the reservoir. So you have this dependency. And that is a political, we need to get that conflict understanding of the dynamics that are there. And once we do that, we can engage in a more targeted peace building and mediation process. So we need to understand those dynamics and see and use them as an opportunity. And that can be the same with climate change in the context of mediation. Can climate impacts, even though they might not be a core driver of conflict, but they're certainly a thing that is playing out and is a factor that is undermining livelihoods. Can the climate development initiative be actually expanding the pie and create opportunities for driving this development forward and driving the peace process forward? I think that is what we need to understand. And I think we need much more research that focuses really on that part of the picture, on understanding those nuances, acknowledging that it's politics, but facilitating it as a peace process. And we wrote a piece in International Affairs last year, which is really trying to outline that. Like, so anybody who's looking for a lot of research questions, like, so here are 5 areas that you can look at where we still need answers. There's so much unanswered questions in this space still.
Yeah, as a layman, Florian, on this topic, I really can't claim any expertise. I was thinking that maybe one added value of framing or inserting climate more directly into the politics of peace building is the fact that you could take some of the direct blame out of the parties and say, okay, climate is changing. Some of it is because of your actions, but also global actions. Okay, it's less your fault. It's maybe, you could blame others, not necessarily the warring parties. So that reduces the stress, that you can't be held to account. It's not my fault. It's not your fault. So that kind of blaming each other will perhaps be a little less. So that's one thing. The other thing, based on what you just said, I was thinking one of the many things I'm interested in is talking about what works, not just all the challenges. We have to also talk about solutions. We have to talk about the positives. Yeah. And in terms of talking more about or building peace based on this climate focus, if we could come up with solutions to water sharing, to maybe even a technical solution to a problem, saying, look, if we focused our resources on this, we can provide you with money. We can resolve the power crisis. We could build more resilience. We could improve the resilience of and the livelihoods of certain communities that are affected. That kind of a solutions-based approach would, in my view, appear appealing.
Absolutely. And I don't want to be like that engineering or technical solutions aren't worthwhile. They obviously are. You need an engineer to drive some of those things forward. The realization we need is that if you purely see it as an engineering problem, the fastest line between A and B is a straight line. If you look at that from a political science or conflict analysis, you're like, well, it's probably a bit more complicated. We need to make a few turns. That's not the most efficient, but it might be the most efficient in a peace building context and a conflict space. But I think it was interesting what you mentioned, the example you used on we might use climate change essentially as an excuse to give actors that's a political decision, isn't it? It's exactly using it as a political tool and as an opportunity. They're certainly ethical and questionable, but to get people to talk, it can be an excellent tool and it can be a factor because there is this dimension that it's an actorless threat. Yeah, I mean, Cullen Hendricks and others have written about that, like climate change is an actorless threat. And I think there is something to that. It is a factor, and that is a unique opportunity for the solution space in conflict resolution is there's a shared vulnerability. That is a factor of environment and climate, right? It's a transboundary. It doesn't stop at a border. So we're all affected. We share this impact. And in that sense, it should really guide exactly your point around solutions about holistic joint effort of cooperation.
I was looking at the data. There's a major increase in conflicts, I think, around the world now. And we could, of course, attribute it to numerous causes, but given that the climate disruption is accelerating, you could say that is also a huge factor. That relationship seems to be rather well established. But if you were to highlight some ongoing peace processes where climate is being used to build peace. Are there any success stories in the recent past or ongoing negotiations where that is happening?
Yeah, I think there are multiple. I think that is a really fascinating evolution we have seen over the last probably 10 years. Let's start with the Security Council context, the UN context. We started in 2007 with debates and should that be an issue? No, maybe. Since 2017, the issue is on the Security Council agenda. And let's take the Security Council as what it is, but this topic is there. Some like that it's there, some don't like that it's there. Especially Russia has an issue with it. But by now it's in I think, around 70 UN resolutions. They're not just presidential statements where we decide this is an important issue, but it's in mission mandates, mostly in the operational paragraph, outlining that climate change is an important issue that demands attention, but increasingly also in operational paragraphs. So there's a clear mandate that UN peace efforts need to take climate change into account. And a consequence of that is that we're seeing, I don't know what the latest number is, I think 6 to 9 UN climate security advisors in the field. So those are people that are doing climate security, climate peace and security issues today within a UN peace operation, advising the special representative of the Secretary General of the mission in how to address climate change in the mission, helping different parts of the mission in coordination and understanding the issues. And that is a tremendous opportunity and potential. And we see as another extension out of that, for instance, in the Horn of Africa, we see an architecture emerging where IGAD, the regional organization in the area, the UN office for the region, and the different countries and UN missions are actually starting to establish work around climate security and identifying it, sharing information, and having sort of this exchange. I mean, does that build peace? I don't know, but it's definitely a step in the right direction that this is identified as a core factor that needs to be taken into account. And the last example is in Somalia, where actually climate change and security, peace and security has been taken up in the national determined contributions. So in the NDCs that are sent to Paris as part of to the UNFCCC as part of the Paris Agreement, with a peace focus, with a focus at solutions. We need to address this because this is having a positive peace impact, moving way beyond do no harm, moving towards a peace building angle. So I think that is really encouraging to see. But that is one case. There are so many others where actually dynamics on the ground are happening that are actively taking these things into account.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that, Florian. This was great fun to chat with you. Thank you very much for coming on my show today.
Thanks for having me. It's great.
Thank you for listening to In Pursuit of Development with Professor Dan Banik from the University of Oslo. Please email your questions, comments and suggestions to inpursuitofdevelopment@gmail.com.